You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have Andrew here. He's going to be talking about the Post-Apostolic Church. And Andrew wanted to, have his own bio read by himself, so he'll be doing that. So welcome, Andrew.
All right. Thank you for having me, Richard. And I appreciate you inviting me and for all the listeners listening in. My name is Andrew, and I have a YouTube channel devoted to the Pre-Nicene era of Christianity. This time period is after the Apostles and before the Council of Nicea. The period spans 250 years, from AD 75 to AD 325. And in that time, there are about 8 volumes of Christian writings that have survived, which give us a great insight into what the Christian church looked like at that time.
This will be very interesting, because I would figure that's a period that is very little is probably known about. But then again, I don't know much about any of this. But
it's true.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I didn't even know about this period even existing until 15 years ago or less, where, I grew up a Christian, and I thought, all we have is the Bible. And while the Bible is the text of Christianity, when I discovered that there were 8 volumes of Christian writings from this time period, I was blown away, thinking, wow, what did the church look like back then?
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. What are some of the things that, in your bio, and then I'll start asking you about this time period?
Sure. The other thing I was going to say is about myself, that when I learned about these writings, I learned from other historians and scholars who have provided a lot of material on the early Christians already. And their material helped me fall in love with those ancient Christians. I developed a deep passion for how they lived and what they taught. So since 2013, I've been sharing my passion through YouTube videos as I present the faith, history, and beliefs of those early Christians. And again, my channel is called Post-Apostolic Church.
What's the response like on YouTube? Are you getting a lot of curiosity, or, what's typical?
Yes. So when I was researching this, I wanted to share the material that I was learning, these early writings, on YouTube. And when I went to YouTube, I saw that there wasn't a channel dedicated to this time in history, in Christian history. And it was a passion of mine. And I saw that YouTube didn't have a channel dedicated to that. And I thought, well, that's what I want. So I felt like it was a God-given purpose of mine to say, all right, let me do this on YouTube, because there's other materials out there that you can get this from. And at the time, I wanted to make YouTube the means of me presenting this information. And so I'm really happy to be able to do that. And since then, I think this topic has become more popular in the last 10 years, and more people have made YouTube channels about this kind of thing, which I think is absolutely great.
Okay. So I don't know, what are some really super interesting things that you learned about this period? I was always wondering, what happens when people that had met Jesus in person had all passed away? How did things change from that point? I know it was, there were still people that had, again, now it would be secondhand at best, the people that the apostles taught, and people that were, much younger and stuff. But what was it like, if that's found in the literature, again, when the people that had met Jesus in person had passed away and no one that had directly interacted with them was around?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I found is that as the church continued after the apostles died, was the students of the apostles then passed on what they learned. And so a lot of these writings, they attest to, this is what the apostles left us, and this is what we do, this is what we believe. And so from what I can tell, that these Christians just carried on what the apostles left, that, as the apostle Paul told Timothy, to pass on what you've learned, and that's what the church did. And so what I see in this early time period is, I see what the apostles left. That, growing up, I heard, the church changed really quickly after the apostles died, and there was an apostasy and the church got corrupt. But when I look into these writings as a historian, when historians look into the history, they don't see like a complete change in culture or core beliefs that happen immediately. Changes in core beliefs happen over time. And so when I look at these early Christians, like this period right after the apostles, I see them teaching the same things as I read in the scriptures. Now, when you have 8 volumes of their writings, they wrote a lot about these things. And to me, it is a fantastic commentary of what the apostles handed down. And so when I read their writings, to me, it's the same as what I read in scripture.
So which of the apostles appears to be written about in the most detail, where you learn things about them that you wouldn't learn just from reading scripture?
I would say the Apostle John. As history shows, the Apostle John lived on to about the year 100. And there are some stories that the Christians passed down that he was involved with that aren't in scripture. And one of those stories has to deal with, near the end of the first century, you had the rise of a different religion called the Gnostics. And the Gnostics had a completely different view of Jesus. And John, living into the year 100, he actually opposed a lot of these Gnostics. And there's some stories about some interactions that John had with them. And actually, they're kind of funny. But
tell me an interesting one.
Okay, for example, what John said about the Gnostics in his letter of 1 John was, if anyone preaches that Jesus did not come in the flesh, they are the Antichrist. And that's what the Gnostics preached. They preached that Jesus wasn't in the flesh, that he didn't die on the cross. And so there's this time where John was going to a bathhouse to bathe, and he heard that this one leading Gnostic was inside. And John yells, "Everybody get out of the bathhouse because that roof might cave in and kill this guy." Basically kind of saying that this guy is such a heretic because he denies the humanity of Jesus that God is just going to kill him at any time, so don't get around it. And to me, that's kind of comical, that John's trying to make a point, but also trying to be funny.
Well, I mean, the Gnosticism arose when? The end of the first century?
Right before the year 100 is when it kind of started, and then it really started picking up in the 100.
So unless it was a much older person around John's age, that none of the Gnostics probably would have met Jesus in the flesh. That's why they said that. And they would have, if it came from the youth, they would not have been alive at the time of the crucifixion.
Right.
But maybe they would have been born in 60 or, let's say even 70. So I guess I can see why that happened. But I don't know, in their interactions with, there will be fewer and fewer people around that had, met Jesus in person. Is there any estimate of a time when many people had seen him, the risen version in person? And do you see in the writing when that fell away and that changed and fewer people were around that would have seen him and interacted with him in person?
Well, the biggest example we have of people seeing Jesus in person is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians. Because, as you know, Paul became a Christian after Jesus was resurrected. So maybe the only time that Paul had an interaction with Jesus was on the road to Damascus. And so Paul wrote about 500 people seeing Jesus at one time. But the early Christians, they just kind of quote the scripture on that because they didn't see Jesus for themselves. And so they say, hey, look, this is what happened. And they quote scripture there.
Is there any accounting of the 500 that saw him, their descendants, their families? Anyone writing about this or talking about it?
No, not that I know of.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Yeah.
Okay. So you said John was the most well described. Any other stories or interesting things about him that are corroborated by these writings?
Sure. I'll share one more story that I remember. When John lived near the end of his life, when he was in modern day Turkey, because historically, they say he died in Ephesus. He was there, and he had discipled this young man. He had converted this young man out of a group of bandits, and this young man became a Christian, and John the Apostle, kind of mentored him and such. Well, John went on a trip. I don't know how many years or how long it was. He comes back, and he hears that this young man left the church and rejoined the bandit group. And what John did was, and this is at the end of his life, so he was close to 90. John, he mounts a horse, and he takes the horse directly into the bandit camp. He goes right into the camp, right up to the guy, and he just submits himself to the bandit saying, hey, I'm here for this guy. I want to bring him back. And John puts his own life in danger in order to try to redeem this young man who went back to being a bandit. And I'm just giving the super summary here, but that's a story that a couple of early Christians talk about that to me is very powerful, and it shows you the heart of John.
Did John have any children or a wife?
As far as I know, the apostles did not have any children. They didn't pass on their teachings like family oriented. They just passed them on to the churches and let the churches do their thing. So I don't know of any children that they would have had.
Okay. And who wrote about the various apostles? Was it one person that wrote about all of them, or only one? Like certain people focus only on John, some on Peter. Like what does it look like?
Different early Christians wrote about the apostles in different ways. But the one person that I would recommend going to is Eusebius. Eusebius wrote in the mid 300s, and Eusebius kind of collected a lot of this in one work. And so his summaries and his collection is highly regarded, as Eusebius took these stories from these earlier Christians who I'm referring to.
Okay. The writings that you've read, do they correlate with Scripture pretty highly?
Yes, they do.
Like what do they talk about that is normally only found in Scripture to people that don't know?
One of the things that the early Christians talked about the most is probably the subject they talk about more often than any other was the deity of Jesus. That they wrote how the only conclusion anyone can come to when you look at Jesus' life is that he must be the Son of God. And they wrote about his deity so often. And that was a big deal for them growing up. In the early Christian days, it was, the Roman Empire was in control, but it was a mostly Greek culture. And so to say that there was a man who lived who was the Son of God was a very big deal in that culture because, they all had the pantheons, whether Greek or Roman. And to say that there's this man that lived, he was God, that was a shock because that was unlike anything that the religions of the day talked about. With the exception of the religions of the day, the Roman Empire, they would say that the emperor was a god. And to say that Jesus was a god meant that you had competing gods. And that's probably the biggest reason why the Roman Empire hated Christianity for centuries, is because Jesus seemed like a competitor to the emperor.
Okay. What did the earliest church look like? So when I've heard people would meet in homes, in groups, but what role did the apostles have in creating the early church, and what role did the people that they taught have in creating the early church?
Right. Okay. So two things I can mention is where they met and who was the leaders of the church, because there's a lot I could say about that question you asked. So, for example, they did meet in homes, like you said. There were very, very few that met in church buildings, even in the early 300s. They met in homes, and Justin Martyr, who lived around the year 160, he has the best account of what they did in their church services. And if you Google Justin Martyr church service or Justin Martyr worship or something like that, you can find some websites that bear it out. And it was very casual. And I really liked reading what he said. He wrote that they took the Lord's Supper every week. That was one thing they did. And then as far as church leadership, they had each city, it seems, had the church leaders. Like there were elders or bishops over a city, and then they kind of arranged the house churches in the city. And there wasn't no central person organizing the entire church. Now, what I'm referring to there is the primacy of the Pope, which the Catholics claim, and that came later, but that did not exist in those first few centuries.
Well, it's funny because they point to St. Peter and him being the rock upon which the church is built, but it wasn't around in the early times.
Now, with Peter being the rock, I do see the early Christians saying that Peter is that rock, that Peter is the one who had the keys to the kingdom that we see in the book of Acts. And it was the Peter who stood up and gave the first sermon. Peter, who was kind of the foremost apostle as he did his things. And Peter did go to Rome, and he was a bishop in Rome. But again, even Peter did not say, I am the leader of the church, I have primacy. Even he didn't say that. It seems like all the apostles saw themselves as equals.
So when did Catholicism arise, and how did it arise? So what was the first denomination or manifestation of the church that had its identity maybe separate, somehow had its own unique identity?
Yeah, so I would say it kind of started with the Council of Nicea. And the Council of Nicea was, as I mentioned before, kind of the end of what my channel is about. And in the Council of Nicea, it identifies, if I remember, 5 centers of Christianity. And those 5 centers were Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Egypt, and I think I'm forgetting one. But it kind of identifies these are the main centers of Christianity, because by 325, those churches were very popular and very well-grounded in things like this. And so after the Council of Nicea, I think Rome, eventually one of the bishops of Rome said, you know what, I am the leader of the whole church. And you had others who said, no, you're not. Let me give you an example. Before the Council of Nicea, around the year 250, there was a bishop of Rome who said, hey, you guys need to follow me. And I forget who it was, but at the time, there was another Christian writer in Carthage named Cyprian. And Cyprian wrote and said, hey, you as a Roman church, we go to you for help. You're a great advisor, but you can't say that you run the whole church. And so Cyprian, there's another writer named Firmilian. They did talk about this, and they said there is no one church over all churches. But again, they did go to Rome. They did go to Alexandria for help, like if there was an issue. Here's another example. In the year 98, the church in Corinth had problems, just like Paul talks about in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. In the year 98, long after Paul, the Corinthians had problems again. There's a faction in there that kicked out the leadership and said, we are leaders now. So the original leadership wrote to Rome and said, hey, can you help us? And the elders in Rome said, okay, let's write a letter and send it to Corinth to try to help them get back on the right track. And this letter is now called First Clement, because in Rome, there was a very popular elder and bishop there named Clement. He's called Clement of Rome. And he is credited as the author of this letter. But First Clement is a letter that Rome wrote back to Corinth to address some of these things. But the letter is more than that. The letter is very beautiful. I really love it. And in fact, First Clement was a letter that was considered to be canon. Like it was considered to be added to the New Testament. In the end, they didn't, because they didn't see it as, Christians didn't see it as inspired. But again, that was a very well-regarded letter. So that's an example of churches trying to help other churches, which did exist.
Okay. Why was the Council of Nicea convened?
Great question. One thing I'd like to point out is, one myth is that at the Council of Nicea, they determined the canon of New Testament scripture. And that is an absolute myth. They did not talk about the canon of the New Testament at the Council of Nicea. What was happening here was, in Alexandria, Egypt, there was a guy named Arius. Arius had this really strange idea about Jesus, saying that Jesus was the Son of God, but Jesus was created by God, saying that there was a time where Jesus did not exist, but God created him. Now, the rest of the church had problems with this because they said that Jesus has always existed with God. And so Arius stirred up the church saying, hey, Jesus was created. And so Arius had, I guess, such a loud voice that it stirred up the church enough that the Emperor Constantine, who was a Christian at the time, said, let's convene this council and talk about Arius and his beliefs. So that was the primary reason for the Council of Nicea. And at the council, over 300 bishops were there from all over the Roman Empire. And out of 300 bishops, if I remember, almost 300 of them signed a document saying Arius is wrong and he should be kicked out of the church. And 3 bishops said Arius is right and sided with him. And then there was a couple handfuls of bishops that decided not to vote. But that was the main purpose of the council, was the controversy that Arius started. So my point is when you've got 98% of the church saying, nope, Arius is wrong, we're going to stick to what we've always believed, that Jesus is eternal. To me, that was a really cool sign to show the unity that the church had. That people will say Arius shows that there was disunity, where really he just had a loud voice. But, again, when 98% of the bishops say, nope, we're going to stick to this doctrine because that's what was handed down, to me that shows that, again, the whole church was united on that regard.
But when did the canonization of the material for the New Testament happen?
That's a great question. So actually, during this Pre-Nicene era, which I have been reading and everything like that, they never established a canon, an official canon. That during this time, there was less dogma during this era of Christianity. There was more, hey, this is what we support and this is what we oppose. There was no decrees that said, this is for sure, you have to agree with this or else. There was none of that. It was just people saying, hey, this is what we use and you should too. And so to answer your question, right after the Council of Nicea, the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius. So this was maybe between the year 325 and 350. Because the Council of Nicea set this precedent of let's make official doctrine and force people to follow it rather than just preaching and letting people decide for themselves. Basically what I mean is the Council of Nicea was a dogma. You agree with this or else. And so Athanasius said, all right, here is the canon that we've been using all along. that's when he took the canon and said, this is our canon, and this is really what you should follow. And Athanasius came up with the same 27 books of the New Testament that we have today. But before the Council of Nicea, what you had was people debating about the books of Scripture, because you had a lot of Gospels floating around in these first couple centuries, and many of them were Gnostic Gospels. So we get back to that. There is a book called the Gospel of Judas. There is a book called the Gospel of Thomas, and these were Gnostic Gospels, and that's what they used.
This may be a silly question, but which came first, Gnostic Gospels or Gnosticism?
Gnosticism.
Okay, so the earliest that any of them could have been written would be, what, the 80s or 90s?
Probably so. I mean, they kind of arose at the same time, the Gnostic Gospels and Gnosticism, because I think the Gospel of Thomas is a first century work and is considered Gnostic. But let me give you an example. In the year 180, you had Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of John, the apostle. So Irenaeus is just 2 degrees of separation removed from John. Irenaeus wrote a lot. He's one of the big writers of this time period. And Irenaeus said that there's only 4 Gospels. He said, these are the 4 Gospels that the apostles handed down, and they're still the ones we use. So he said, this is the 4 Gospels. But again, he didn't say you have to agree with these or else. In fact, let me throw out another writer. There's one called Clement of Alexandria. He lived in Alexandria. And he read all the Gnostic stuff. He read tons of things, and he actually put value in any work he read. He said, this is an interesting work because of this. And so what that tells me is that these early Christians, they weren't going around book burning. That they said, here's our 4 Gospels, here's the letters of Paul, here's the letters of Peter, here's Revelation. But they didn't say you shouldn't read anything else. They just said, we're trying to identify what's inspired, what's Scripture, but we're not going to tell you to not read things. Although, of course, the early Christians were very big opponents and very condemning of Gnosticism.
So what do you think happened? The 4 Gospels, do you think they were written by the apostles themselves, or do you think the apostles sat with their apprentices and dictated it to them and they wrote it down? Like, who did the writing, you think?
Oh, I've got great information on that. That's a great question. Okay, so with Matthew, the early Christians said that Matthew originally wrote it in the Hebrew dialect. Now, when I see Hebrew dialect, that means one of 2 things. It means he originally wrote it in Hebrew, or he wrote it in Aramaic. Now, historically, it probably is Aramaic, because the only people who spoke Hebrew in the first century were the highest scholars in Jerusalem, highest Jewish scholars in Jerusalem. And so Matthew wrote his gospel in Aramaic, I believe, but he wrote it in that, and then it was immediately translated into Greek so that everyone could read it. And I think that's very fascinating. As for the Gospel of Mark, when Peter arrived in Rome, he arrived there and Peter would preach to the Romans, and he would even preach directly to the Roman Senate. And as Peter would preach to the Romans and the Roman Senate, John Mark was there, and John Mark wrote down the things that Peter preached. So actually, the Gospel of Mark is the preaching of Peter. And when I heard that, I thought that was very fascinating. As for the Gospel of Luke, Luke was a very studied person, and Luke even begins his gospel with his own introduction, showing that he did the research into writing this gospel. Because as you know, there's no evidence whether or not Luke saw Jesus. So Luke wrote his gospel from all the witnesses who did, and one of the big witnesses that Luke used was Paul. I think a lot of what Luke got into his gospel, he learned from Paul. Of course, Paul had learned from other people who witnessed Jesus. The Gospel of Luke was written by Paul. It was written by Luke, but a lot of it comes from Paul. And then as for John, he wrote it himself. And it is, you can tell that John had a very different style of writing, which is very beautiful. And it's from John, and he probably wrote it later in life.
Yeah, what would you expect to see in the Gospel of Matthew then? Because if it was translated from Aramaic, which I'm not disagreeing, it probably was, how would it render itself differently than someone writing it directly into Greek?
I would say the one big difference would be the Old Testament quotations that Matthew gives. Because if Matthew's writing in Aramaic, he's probably going to take from the Aramaic Old Testament, or maybe even directly from the Hebrew Old Testament that was only available in Jerusalem. So Matthew may have used the Aramaic or Hebrew for the Old Testament quotations, while the rest of the Old Testament, they took their Old Testament quotations from the Greek Septuagint. Because when Jesus shows up on the scene, there are different versions of the Old Testament. There's some Aramaic versions. Really, the only Hebrew versions would have been in Jerusalem. But by and large, most Jews use the Greek Septuagint for their Old Testament. And you can see that very heavily in Paul's writings. When Paul quotes from the Old Testament, he almost always quotes from the Septuagint.
How do you know he's doing?
Okay, so that's a great question. So today we have two ancient Old Testament manuscripts. One is called the Masoretic. It's called that because there was the Masoretic Jews who lived around the year 900 BC. And they collected the Old Testament as they could, and they cleaned it up, they combined it, they preserved it. And so we have what's called the Masoretic text, which is that Old Testament. And that is the oldest version of the Hebrew we have. It goes back to the year 900.
900 BC.
900 AD. So that's actually fairly recent if you think about it. That's our oldest complete Old Testament. It comes from 900 AD.
What about the Dead Sea Scrolls, though?
Okay, well, let me get to that in a second, because you have the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint is a translation from the Hebrew Old Testament that was started in 250 BC. So long before Jesus, you had the Jewish scribes in Jerusalem. They went down to Egypt, and they translated the Old Testament into Greek. And it was an official, approved copy of the Old Testament in Greek, because it was sanctioned or approved by the high priest in Jerusalem. And so the Septuagint started in 250 BC, and it quickly became very popular because Greek was the main language of those centuries, thanks to the Greek conquests. Okay, so as for the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's actually a third family of manuscripts. And what's beautiful about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they were written in the 100s BC and 100s AD, but yet they were discovered in the 1800s AD. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are like a valuable time capsule where we can go from their discovery 150 years ago or so all the way back to the first century and see what were the scriptures like, because those actual manuscripts, those actual pieces of paper are from the first century. And so that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so valuable. So when Paul's writing his letters, he can choose to take from the Aramaic Old Testament, or he can choose to take from the Greek Old Testament. And more often than not, he takes from the Greek, because there are differences between the Masoretic Hebrew and the Septuagint Greek, that over time there's been differences. But when we look at what we have today, it's clear that Paul favors the Greek version over the ancient Hebrew version, or the old Aramaic version.
No, because I would think someone translating from Aramaic, I forget where it is. Jesus says to Peter, do you love me? But he says, do you agape me? Do you agape me? And then do you phileo me?
Yes.
So those kinds of nuances, would they be missed? Or how would they be interpreted differently if someone was translating from Aramaic, because they had that cultural background, into Greek versus a native speaker that is writing it straight up in Greek? What do you imagine the differences could be? Like, does anyone study this? I know you can't know everything, but have you seen any insight into this?
That's just an issue with translation, which is always the case. I mean, the two words that Jesus used do translate as love. Agape is what I might call the purest form of love, like it's the highest calling of love, the selfless kind of love. And then the other one, phileo, is more of like, I love pizza, which, is used as I'm fond of pizza, or I'm very friendly toward pizza because pizza's delicious. And so what Jesus did there was he goes from the highest calling of love to, Peter, do you like me? And, just kind of say, you may not love me right now, but do you like me right now? And so this just comes down to translation, and every translation that comes out is going to miss some of those things. And I hope they don't, but sometimes translations do.
Okay. So do you think that the Gospels were dictated by, from apostle to student? Or do you think they were written directly by the given apostles? And what do you think what do you think happened to them? Is there any mention of the originals? Do they have any significance in any of these books or mention?
No, the originals are completely lost. And in my studies, I find that that's better. It's better than that happens, because if the original actual piece of paper that the apostle wrote on existed, then it would just be kind of human nature to exalt that piece of paper as some kind of holy object. And it's not the paper or the ink or the pen that the apostle used that makes it holy. It's the message on the paper. And so to me, I think it's better that the originals were lost, because otherwise we might have the wrong kind of attitude toward the writing. Plus, because they dictated the letter and then they made copies of the letter, that is a valuable thing, because when you have all these copies floating around, you see that, okay, it's not this one that we can say, oh, this is it or this is not. We look at all the copies and we say, okay, let's look at when everybody has a copy, we can compare them and see where the common denominator is between them and see that. And that's how historians do that. I mean, they do that with all ancient things. They look for copies and they compare the copies to say, okay, based on how we look at this, what's the original? And every translator is trying to do that because some copies have variances and differences. And so a good translator will look at all copies and say, okay, based on what I see, which one is more likely the original? But to your other question, I think that most of the apostles probably dictated their gospel to someone who wrote it down. Like, those two people are together, especially with Peter and John Mark. Peter being someone who was very much not educated, I wonder if Peter even knew how to write. And so him being an uneducated fisherman, he could speak God's words and someone else write it down. And then from there, copies were made. And I think it was more like that. Even Paul, when you look at his letters, I think he used a copyist or a transcriber to write his gospels as he spoke them. Because in one of his letters, he says, hey, look, I'm writing this with my own hand, Paul, as if, he's saying, I'm signing this. And so I get the impression that they used transcribers to write the Gospels and the New Testament letters.
Okay. No, very interesting. That's why I'm asking all these questions.
Oh, yeah. This interesting stuff is what got me passionate about this topic. It really got me interested in love with it. And I'm learning all this historical stuff. And yeah, there's some stories that you may think, well, that sounds too crazy to be true. And maybe it is too crazy to be true. But what a historian does is they go into this material and says, what do they have to say? And let me look at it and consider it. Let me say this, that because of my interest in the early Christian writings, where I'm learning all these things, it has really turned me into an historian. That I'll say this, that when I was in high school, I hated history. I hated it. And I said, why do we need to learn history? It's already happened. Because of their writings and seeing how history is played out and seeing how it plays out in the same way today, now I really understand what historians mean when they say, we need to learn history, otherwise we will make the mistakes of the past. And so now, for me, as a historian, when I see mankind and humankind and culture repeating the mistakes of the past, as a historian, I'm the one face-palming, thinking, come on, guys, this has happened before. Stop making these mistakes.
Yeah.
So my point is that I have fallen in love with history through all this. And all these questions you're asking are fantastic because this is what I want to know. I want to know the how, the why, the where. And so that has been my passion for the last more than 10 years, is to try to find out just these things. And a lot of the questions you've asked, they're questions that every Christian can ask and maybe should ask. But some of these details aren't really helpful for everyday life. And I will admit that, and that's okay. I mean, because as a Christian, I want to learn the history. I want to learn all the details of how it happened. But at the same time, I want to make sure my life is right as a Christian. And so even though, talking about how the Gospels came to be, maybe that doesn't mean anything in everyday Christian life, to me, I'm still very fascinated by it. I love looking into it. And so I'm trying to get both sides here, both the ancient witnesses to how these things happened, plus trying to understand how do I live my life today with living it according to Jesus and according to the scriptures.
Right. Any insights into why the Gospels and or Paul's letters were written when they were written? Like, why did John wait so long, supposedly, to write his gospel? Did he feel like it was not needed? Is there any indication of that thought process?
I'm not sure. I read somewhere, and this is one of those things where I don't know if it's exactly true, but someone may have, when John was later in life, and I think he wrote his gospel after he came back from his exile on Patmos. I believe he did. And so I think people asked him.
I thought Revelation says he was on the island of Patmos when he wrote that.
Correct. Yes. Paul wrote Revelation while he was on Patmos, but the early Christians said that he actually was released from Patmos later on.
Oh, so you think that Revelation was written before the Gospel of John?
I'm saying I think so.
Wow.
I think so. I could be wrong because all these happened when John was in his 80s or 90s. And so my guess is that his age. So yeah. But I think people asked him to write a gospel because he was so old. He was maybe going to die soon. People said, hey, will you do it because you saw Jesus? And again, I could be wrong, but I think he was a little reluctant, but he did. And the early Christians, and when they talk about John's gospel, they call it a spiritual gospel, that John did it with a completely, I think, more personal, more loving approach to the relationship he had with Jesus. As you may know, he often referred to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so John's gospel, I think, is less factual and more relational, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, when I read through all four of them, one right after the other, and that's the feeling I got from reading John, is that, I felt loved and cared for. It was like, it was that. Matthew's was probably the harshest, and maybe because he was a tax collector, that he was just like a grizzled New Yorker or something.
Matthew is absolutely directed at attacking and opposing the Jewish leadership of that time.
Yeah, and then Mark, which I guess was Peter, is just like very boom, 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 boom. There's not much. And Luke's was very historical, so they all feel totally different in how they're written. It's interesting.
Absolutely. Oh, and I'll bring up a question right now. What about the Q document?
I don't know what that is. What is that?
Q theory is this theory that there was a gospel that has since been lost, but it was a gospel that Matthew, Mark, and Luke pulled from to make their gospels. It was like a pre-gospel. So this is this thing called Q theory. And so me being an historian, I'm like, okay, let me look into this and see if it's true. And there is absolutely zero evidence to this Q theory. And scholars will subscribe to the Q theory because they look at the literary similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They'll see they're almost quoting each other. And to that I say, yes, they are. They are using each other because maybe they're using the same oral sources, the people who saw Jesus. Or maybe Matthew's came out so early that they used that Mark and Luke pulled from Matthew. That's true too. But the idea that the theory of Q, that there being this pre-gospel, there's no evidence for it whatsoever. So I do reject that.
I had a thought. I spoke to people that study near-death experiences, and one thing they say is that the person remembers everything decades later, every detail. I would think seeing God in life would be like that. Not necessarily you're near death, but the experience is so radical that you remember every detail. And I think that's why, for instance, John would have been able to write with such clarity decades later. Yes. That's why he would have remembered everything. That's just my feeling.
Right. Yeah.
So what surprising things have you learned from your study so far? Like things that just amazed you?
Let me think. So I'll answer this question this way with a little bit about my journey in finding the early Christians. So I grew up in a conservative Christian church that very heavy reliance on the scriptures. And as I grew up, I saw a lot of these denominations of churches, different ideas. And growing up in the church I did, they would say, well, here's why these other groups are wrong. And I would say, okay. But I dove into the scriptures, and I definitely use the scriptures as my standard on what is right and wrong. Well, fast forward to my college years, I was diving into the scriptures, and I was realizing that in the Christian church that I grew up in, there were differences in that church to what I saw in the scriptures. And that caused me to go on a journey. In fact, I even asked God, will you put me on a journey to find the true church, if it exists? And so I went on this journey for, I'm going to say, the next 8 years. And in that time, God exposed me to a lot of interesting religions, and that's another story. But when I found the early Christians and their writings, they meant a lot to me because of the journey I was on. So, for example, in the scriptures, you have a lot of things. Let me start with what is called the two sacraments, and that is baptism and the Lord's Supper. And I'm using those as an example. So growing up, I heard, is baptism necessary for salvation, or is it not? The Lord's Supper, is it something that is transubstantiation, or is it consubstantiation, or is it just memorialism? That's it. And so I would wonder these things, which is true. And so fast forward, I find the early Christians and I see what they taught, and they say, this is what the apostles gave us. And I see what they taught about baptism and about the Lord's Supper, and I was blown away. And so to me, that's the fascinating stuff, is I've had all these questions in my head for years. What's right? What's wrong? And when I read what they said about it, and of course, I think their witness is very strong, since they're about as close to the apostles as you can get without reading the actual scriptures. And so when I read what they wrote about those things and how they argued baptism or the Lord's Supper, I thought, okay, this is what I'm looking for, because this is what the whole church believed after the apostles. And so to sum up, to me, the early Christians are an answer to all my doctrinal and practical questions, because the things that they taught. And there were some topics that they taught that I already agreed with, and I was pleasantly surprised. But there were other things they taught that I was shocked about and thinking, whoa, they did that? That is interesting. And it really challenged me to look deeper and to re-examine scripture and say, are they right or are they wrong? And so, even now I've really kind of got a good idea of everything they taught on a high level plane, but there's some details that I'm still kind of like, oh, that's so really neat. And so my point is, with my journey, that's why I am fascinated by their writings, is because I feel like they have the best answers that any church could give, whether it's modern or ancient. I think they have the best interpretation of Scripture.
Okay. So, I mean, now when you read Scripture, I don't know, has it come to life more? Have you studied, the Koine Greek? Have you studied Aramaic? Are you able to read it natively, or like where are you at in your personal journey in reading?
No, learning a language, I've decided is too hard for me. No, too much effort. Thankfully, I have some tools that help me with the original languages. I mean, there's one that I've used for over 15 years. It's called eSword. It's a really ancient program that has a few translations, and then it has the Greek interlinear right next to it. And that has really skyrocketed my language studies. But no, I don't speak natively. I like to tell people that I do know enough about the early languages to be dangerous.
Gotcha. So what's next? Is there more material for you to go through in this period? Like, were you out of material? You just have to analyze what you have now? Like, how are you continuing your journey of learning?
I have skimmed through all the major things that they talked about, try to see what they said about this and that. And so I have a good grasp on the high level, but I haven't got down into the details yet. For example, I've used a lot of the material that other scholars have pulled together because they've summarized the early Christians in a lot of ways. And so that's been a really good crash course for me to get an overview, high level of what they believed. And so now what I've been doing the last few years is just getting into the details, getting into the actual quotes that they gave that are very powerful and the arguments they made. And so really it's just getting into the details now. And that's what I use for my videos. When I make my videos on my channel, I don't use material by scholars or historians. Yes, their material has helped, but when I want to share what the early Christians believed, I really want to go to the primary source and let them speak for themselves. And so while I get the gist of it from the other scholars' materials, I do go into their writings and try to find what did they actually say. And that has been great. And so that's a lot of my research now. My research is getting into their actual writings and looking at them in context and all that good stuff.
Are there more writings to be had? Is anyone, archaeologically, historically, is there anything more to be had? Or
I would say,
how do you go from here?
I would say that's always true. They do still find documents written by some of these early Christians. For the most part, though, I'm not considering those because you really have to have an ear to the ground in the scholarly world to know, oh, we found something, here it is. For me, my focus has been on this collection of writings called the Ante-Nicene Fathers, which means before Nicaea fathers. And this collection, which is the 8 volumes I told you about, they were translated and compiled in the late 1800s. Because in the 1800s, there was a renaissance in early Christian documents. For some reason, in the 1800s, that's when a lot of archaeologists and other people found these ancient documents. They found the Codex Sinaiticus in the 1800s. They found Codex Vaticanus in the Vatican in the 1800s. And those had been lost for centuries. And so they were finding all these documents in the 1800s because they realized, oh, these have been lost. Let's go find some. And so they find these documents, and then in the late 1800s, the Ante-Nicene Fathers was published. And that was all the documents up to that point. And what's great about the Ante-Nicene Fathers is that because it's so old, it's public domain. And so that allows me to have one source that is free that I can dive into and really understand. And so there's advantages to that. And so I've decided just to stick to that and not some of the newer documents coming out because I do have a one-stop shop now that's extremely good, extremely well respected. And so I'm not really considering new documents because besides, I think if we find new documents, I don't know if we're going to learn all those new things because we already have so many documents. We already do know what they believed on topics.
Well, excellent, Andrew. So, please restate your YouTube channel, and that's where people can go to find out more.
Sure. It is Post-Apostolic Church on YouTube. Post-Apostolic referring to after the time of the apostles. And YouTube is my only presence. I don't have any other social media. So if you go there, you can see my videos. And I have about 80 videos on there right now. If you would like to contact me, my email is postapostolicchurch@gmail.com. And email is the best way to reach me, and I do respond to all of them.
Okay, excellent. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. It's been a great call. Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.